Hello, everyone. My name's Maclean, and it's my pleasure to interview my colleague in HAL, Professor Ludmila Stern, who is Professor of Translating and Interpreting. And one of the brilliant things of my current role is I get to read all of my colleagues' research as I collected. And I was reading your article, Ludmila, A Woman with a Camera, Soviet Espionage in Interwar France, which was published last year in The Global Impacts of Russia's Great War and Revolution, published by Indiana University Press. And you kindly agreed to talk to me about it, which I think is going to be very exciting. So welcome, and please tell us how you got to this piece of research.
Thank you very much, Kama, and thank you for inviting me to speak about this research. Originally, my research area had to do with Western intellectuals and the Soviet Union in the interwar period, that is 1920s, 1930s. And I was interested in this subject matter because my grandparents, my late grandparents, used to be French communists of Polish Jewish birth. And I was fascinated by the fact that Stalinist Soviet Union was attractive to them. So that's what started my original research. And that research that amounted to my book, Western Intellectuals and the Soviet Union. This original research was not only about inspirational attraction of Western intelligentsia to the Soviet Union, writers, scientists, teachers, students, but also about the way the Soviet Union developed mechanisms of attraction of Western intellectuals and not necessarily communists. So in this book, which was based on my PhD, I looked at different stories and different Soviet so-called cultural organizations and the way they developed and fine-tuned their mechanisms of attracting Western left-wing leaning intellectuals. And so I was also looking as part of that project at how Western intellectuals became attracted to the Soviet Union. What was the appeal? And as we know today, the appeal was that the Soviet Union was viewed as an advanced society with social justice, with excellent health and education system, with avant-garde art and literature. So all of that was very attractive to Western intellectuals. But also I have shown, thanks to the Soviet archives, various mechanisms of attraction, a lot of tactics of creating the illusion of friendship. And then the way these Soviet organizations influenced French, German, American, English visitors to present a very positive side of the Soviet Union, to play down the violence and the repression, and in a way to doctor and to edit this image as a very positive one. So I would say that this was the starting point of my research. And as I was working on it, I was using the newly opened Soviet archives that was in the mid-1990s, early 2000s. And it seemed like a gold mine because suddenly you could see this different narrative that had been not available until then.
Extraordinary. It must have been so exciting when they opened up.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah.
Now, this particular paper we're talking about is actually a story about your grandmother, and so in some ways it's a family history, it's a political history, and in some ways it's a very personal history. That must have been a real difference for you?
Yes, and even when I was thinking about this interview, I kept asking myself, so what is this paper about? Clearly, it started with family history because later on in life, I found out that my grandmother wasn't just a communist, but she was an agent in an espionage network. So she worked for the benefit of the Soviet Union. But she never really spoke about what she did. And I know that first of all, her network has covered different strata of the French society. I knew that they gathered military information, but I didn't know whom she was working for exactly, because, several Soviet organizations also created espionage networks in the West. One of them was NKVD, that would turn into KGB. Then there was the Comintern, Communist International. And then there was also the headquarters of the Red Army with its famous, or rather notorious, GRU, Chief Intelligence Department. And we would have heard about GRU quite recently with the Skripal affair in the United Kingdom, and earlier on with also other espionage cases in the West. So I wanted to know who my grandmother was working for, and also what motivated her to become a spy, because it's one thing to be an idealistic, enthusiastic communist, but it's another to actually break the law and conduct espionage in a country that gave her the opportunity to study. She studied medicine at the Sorbonne University in Paris, like my grandfather. She gathered information against the country that she loved, because we know she was talking about how much she loved France and her life in France. But I think that was the beginning to find out a little bit more about the Soviet system of espionage, who was doing what and for whom. And that led me to the foreigners case. That was a big 1933 case of a big spying ring with more than 33 co-accused, and my grandmother was one of them. So I was looking both at what she did, how, who else was involved. I was trying to find out who recruited her and why she would agree. And as we know, she ended up in jail, like most of her co-accused. And my mother was also born in the Paris jail of Fresnes. Yeah.
So just to go a step back then, she was born in Poland,
Yes.
but was unable to go to university in Poland as a result of women not being allowed to go to university, or Jewish women not being allowed?
Jewish people generally. There was a numerus clausus, so there was a very limited number of Jews who were admitted to tertiary educations and institutions, and quite a significant number of young Polish Jews went to France, where they could enter universities.
And she married your grandfather there?
She married my grandfather, who was also in a similar situation, also a Polish Jew who studied medicine. They met and married in Paris.
So do you know if she became the espionage agent before she met him or after? Is there any sense of the time frame?
I think she probably became a spy a little bit after she had met him. They were both communists, but I'm not sure that he was a card-holding member of the Communist Party, whereas she was, and she had to leave the ranks of the party not to compromise it by association when she became an espionage agent. My grandfather was uninvolved in the espionage. He must have known, because various documents tell us that he often accompanied her to meetings or to the a safe house. But initially he was also arrested at the same time as she was in December 1933, but he was released.
And so she would have been pregnant when she was arrested?
Sorry?
She was pregnant when she was arrested?
She was pregnant, yes. She must have been she probably just got pregnant, because my mother was born at the end of August the following year. Yeah.
Mm. So it becomes even more interesting to try and unwind why she chose to become an agent in this particular instance. If her, the extent to which her husband knew, the extent of her, her family plans, obviously, but also her own ambition to become a doctor at the Sorbonne, are all compromised by her decision to become, involved with espionage. So an extraordinary set of decisions. Why did she decide to do this?
Well, this is something that I have been trying to figure out, and I think she was very conflicted in many ways. So on the one hand, we can say, okay, she was a communist. Okay, she had this predisposition. She was a very enthusiastic and very spontaneous person. I don't know how much reflection was involved in that decision making. I also know that before she came to France, she was a member of another organization. It was a socialist, secular, Zionist organization that in the early 20s aligned itself with the Communist Party. So maybe the transition from one organization to another was not quite as surprising. What is surprising is that she seems to have sabotaged her and her husband's plans. At the time when it happened, he was preparing his naturalization so that they could stay and work in France. So that was not part of the plan. Another feature is that she was one of 6 children in a rather poor family. And because she was considered to be the brightest, they sent her to Paris to study. So she was a disappointment to her family as well. And after she was set free, there was no question of her going back to Poland, where her involvement in espionage has brought tremendous shame upon her family. So there is this unresolved question about why.
And she never talked about it.
Well, no, that's the point. More eminent spies, which she was not, she was a rank and file agent, but eminent spies often leave memoirs and diaries. Somebody as eminent and prominent as Richard Zorge, who spent 2 years in a Tokyo jail, wrote 2 or 3 volumes of memoirs. But as far as she was concerned, she never spoke about why, except for saying that it was not her choice. And I understand that she probably signed some papers, some undertaking of non-disclosure. She was saying that one day she would tell me, except she never did.
How disappointing.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have photographs of her?
I do have some photographs of her, and I'll show you both. So the first photograph, which I hope, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So
it's
a mug shot. So that was a photo that my grandmother, it was a photo of my grandmother on the day of her arrest, the 18th of December, 1933. And when I look at this photo and this very defiant look in her eyes, I'm trying to imagine what she was thinking, especially knowing that she was caught red-handed. She never denied her participation in it, but at the same time, she was pregnant. And I'm about to show you another photo of her during her trial. So this photo comes from the Contemporary newspaper. And on the day of her trial, she was transported to the court together with her baby, whom she's holding. And the baby by then would be about 6 months old. Apparently, she was urged to pass the baby on to a social worker. She refused, and the baby effectively slept through the hearing. So that's the first photo of my mother that we have. I've never seen her photos as a child.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that when the USSR collapsed and the archives became open, you were able to start researching your book, but I suspect you were never really, I mean, the files on espionage would still be quite hard to access.
Yeah, that's right. And it is still impossible. Earlier on, I mentioned NKVD. Those archives are beyond reach. I mentioned the Comintern. Those archives were open except for the files on espionage. But because her espionage was of a military nature, and she worked for the headquarters of the Soviet Army, or the Red Army as it was known then, there is still no access to those archives, not for the Western, nor the Soviet or Russian researchers. Now, how did I then establish the story of her activities? I began by searching in the archives of the headquarters of the police in Paris. And I was warned that possibly there will be absolutely nothing, even though my grandmother's surname turned out to be on the file. And I remember the moment when they brought this yellow manila folder and they said to me, look, don't be disappointed if you don't find anything. Some of these folders contain nothing. And I opened this folder, and the first thing I saw was my grandmother looking at me. It was that mugshot. It was that mugshot that opened that file. And that file was fascinating, probably the most fascinating of all, because it had all the police reports. She was followed. So all the reports of undercover French police that they wrote was in that folder. There were reports on all her family members who also moved to Paris. So I found out a lot more about her siblings as well. I found out where she lived, where my grandfather lived, where they lived together, where she was arrested. There was a whole history of her landlord and neighbors reporting on them. So it was a wealth of information. I also found out that there was what this spying ring was. So I could then continue my research in different archives of the French security, national security, where I found out a lot more about the entire organization, about the recruited these agents, about how they operated, what they did, where they obtained the secret military documents, how my grandmother was trained to take photos. They gave her a Leica camera, very rare in those days, and taught her how to take photos, and how she was acting as a courier to various parts of France and abroad, taking these photographs and microfilms.
I mean, you would think, given the rareness of the camera, that taking a photograph in public would have alerted the police to you and been something of a red flag, really.
Yeah, well, she was not taking photographs in public. They were documents. They were military documents, plans of French mobilization, structures of various types of weaponry, reports about the development of poisonous gases, of botulism, bacillus, the structures of the most recent tanks and planes, everything the Soviet Union was interested in. So my grandmother's task was to try and befriend somebody in military and scientific institutions who would pass these documents on to her. She would then go to a safe house and she would photograph them there. And later on, she would act as a courier and deliver them.
Mm-hmm. I understand. I thought perhaps the title that you chose, "The Woman with a Camera," was really quite, revealing.
Yeah, Yeah, because that's what she did. Photographed these documents. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary story, Ludmila, and so interesting on just so many levels. And the family aspect, I think, is probably the last one. I mean, clearly you were really animated by chasing what is effectively a family story. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, everyone says that, you know, we are all writing our own histories through the histories that we write, but this is more personal than I've ever attempted in history writing, anyway.
It was, I think it is true to say that it started as family history and it ended. I documented something that we knew nothing about. But I have to say that in the process, I felt more as a historian rather than a granddaughter who was trying to unravel some interesting bits of her grandmother's story. And that is, of course, true. And I know that my mother, who knew absolutely nothing about where she was born, what happened in the first 2 years of her life, how they found their way to the Soviet Union in 1936. So it's very hard to separate what is family history, what is researching family history, and what is researching the history of Soviet supporters in those days. And I have to say that I did not idealize my grandmother. I know that when I was growing up in the Soviet Union, there was this sense of a heroic aura that surrounded her and my grandfather. Well, you know, they used to be communists. They were political migrants in the Soviet Union. They followed their ideals. But when I researched her story, I did try to understand how her recruitment occurred, what triggered her, what was her mindset, what was her motivation. And I have to say that intuitively, at some level, I can understand it, but cerebrally, not really. You know, we can talk about Marxist dialectics and the new ethics and the better good of society and, you know, historical network and so on and so forth. But when it comes to individuals, it's very difficult to actually try and wrap it all up neatly as a story. So I think my research is not over yet. And it is something that I'd like to think about more and more deeply.
I think it's a fascinating project on so many levels, but it's the most fascinating period. And the transnational connections, particularly in Europe, are just so rich and exciting. And I wish you all the best with it. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Kama.